Good morning, everybody. My name is Korah. I'm the coordinator for the Center of Excellence for Behavior Management. Today, we're going to do a presentation on trauma and other, behavioral situations that can come up that can affect the functionality of the student in the classroom, learning, and so forth, and looking at how the Pyramid of Intervention and the Nurturing Support Center, which is part of the Pyramid of Intervention, can help support some of these student challenges. So I'm going to share screen and open my PowerPoint. Very excited to be doing this with all of you. And so one of the things that I really wanted to make clear today, and it's not necessarily specific to trauma, but of course trauma is part of it, is when we're looking at student behavior, of course there can be so many reasons behind why certain behaviors are coming up. Whether it's because there's different emotions that are pushing the student to react, frustration can be one, alarm and anxiety can be another one. And so those are the main core ones where we get a lot of different reactions. Instincts is another, for those who have listened to other material from the Neufeld Institute and from the Center of Excellence for Behavior Management. We talked about the instinct of counterwill, which is the opposition and the resistance from student and how that can push behavior. Same thing with the instinct that we call the alpha instinct, which is the need to take charge, to take over, and how sometimes we've got students that are very bossy, very dominant, and how that can impact their behavior. Of course, immaturity is a huge piece. We can see it with our little ones, but not just with the little ones. We see it with students that are more have blockages in their defenses and that are more immature given the blockages. And so that has an impact too, because they're more impulsive, they don't have the filter that's working as well and so forth. And so trauma we're going to be looking at today, but I thought it was really important to not just put the focus on trauma. Yes, trauma can be one reason, one explanation as to why behavior is having a hard time tempering itself, but there's so many other issues that can play into it. Defense is another one. Whether the attachment is not working well for the student, and of course, thinking of our sensitive children and adolescents. And so hypersensitivity plays a role where it can push students in different directions if they're being overwhelmed and such. And so since today we're focusing more on the trauma piece, for those who are interested in doing further reading on trauma, these are key authors that are out there that speak about trauma. And so Bruce Perry is one who wrote a book with Oprah Winfrey on What Happened to You. That's a terrific book. Another great author is Bessel van der Kolk that talks about, can't remember the title of the book, but something about, talks about trauma and the impact on the body. Peter Levine is out of the US, and does a lot of training and information and resources on healing the body, those that have gone through trauma. Gabor Mate, who's also co-wrote the book with Gordon Neufeld on Hold On to Your Kids, also wrote a more recent book called The Myth of Normal. I love that book. This is definitely a great read for trauma. A local researcher, Delphine Colline Vizina, who has written things in French and is working with some of our Québécois universities, has done some research and some writing on trauma. Stephen Porges and Mona de la Houque. So Stephen Porges is a neuroscientist, and Mona de la Houque is a psychologist that works in schools. She too is a great resource in terms of trauma. David Melnick is one. I don't know if CQSB has had the opportunity to hear David Melnick. A lot of the Quebec English school boards have invited him. He's from out of the US and does trauma transformative types of information. And so again, another great author. The Australian Childhood Foundation on their website have tons of editorials. And last but not least is all of the research on the adverse childhood experiences. And so there's a study that was done with that. And we're going to talk a bit more about that. And so I mentioned Gabor Mate's book, The Myth of Normal. And so I just wanted to quote him for a second. And so when we're talking about trauma, so understanding what really trauma is. And so trauma is not necessarily what happens to you specifically. So it's not the situation itself, but what happens inside of you. So how it impacts you. And I'll give you an example to make it really simple. I was working with a team yesterday and we were talking about a student who has had some hospitalizations when he was little because of severe asthma and such. And so hospitalization is seen as a separation, but given that this boy is very sensitive, this actually created a traumatic impact on this boy. And we can see now in his day-to-day that there is a lot of impact on his system, on his, and so forth. And so if we just looked at it as the incident, as the event, people wouldn't necessarily think of hospitalization as a traumatic event per se. But given at the age of where the child is and how long they were hospitalized and how the parents reacted and if they came to visit and so forth, that it's so how it happens inside of you. Another piece that's really important. So here's the book from Bruce Perry, What Happened to You. And so in Bruce Perry's book, he talks about the different pieces that play into trauma. And so it's not just in the day-to-day of an individual's experience, it also plays into the genetics. And so research has proven that from generation to generation, trauma can actually be passed down through DNA, through genetics. For example, there was research that was done with rats where they put pressure and stress onto the female rat to see if the babies would be affected in their limbic system. And so it has shown in fact that when the female rat has been stressed prior to being pregnant and during pregnancy, that has had an impact on the baby. But they've also tried to do the stressing onto the male rat to see if that could put on some stress onto the baby. And they were able to show that even through the male DNA, stress can be passed down from generation to generation. And so we can think about the families that we work with, where from the grandparents to the parents and whatever, we could even think about our Aboriginal communities that we work with and some of the long-term trauma that has happened with some of these cultures, that can be passed down genetically. Of course, there's a lot of research that has shown that during the pregnancy, whether the mother was experiencing stress during her pregnancy, whether there were, abuse of alcohol and drugs and so forth, that can have an impact onto the baby. It's been shown that the mother, through the umbilical cord, she's the one who helps calibrate the amygdala and the limbic system. And so if the mother has gone through trauma and stress herself during the pregnancy, that can impact the calibration of the amygdala of the child once they're born. Of course, the birth itself, if it's been a traumatic birth, can have an impact on the child. The younger the child is, and when the traumatic situation has happened, the deeper it can impact. And so when you have a newborn or you have a very young baby, some of these early on childhood traumas do have a bigger impact than when it's happened later in life. And of course, anything that's been after birth, whether it's through family situations, traumatic situations, the family, and that's when we're going to look at the ACEs study, and of course in the culture and so forth. And so when we're talking about the brain, I mentioned before the amygdala, and so here's the amygdala. And the amygdala is one of the key elements in the limbic system. And this is basically where the stress response start off from. So for those who may not be so familiar, I'll just kind of walk you through it for a second. And so the way that it works in the limbic system is that once the brain has picked up that there's something in the environment that is threatening or that is dangerous, the amygdala will send a signal, kind of like a smoke detector type of signal, to the hypothalamus, which is right here. And the hypothalamus will now orchestrate a response through the endocrine system. And this is where all of the chemistry will happen in the body with the flight, fight, freeze response. So where the cortisol will happen, the adrenaline will happen. So it's the hypothalamus that will release those hormones into the body through the sympathetic nervous system. But it's the amygdala that kicks off the whole kind of sequence of things. And so if we look at it from another angle, because yes, the limbic system is very central and the limbic system is related to our emotions, but even at a more primitive part of the brain, you do have in the diencephalon, the arousal part, and this too also plays into the flight, fight, freeze. And now there's actually a fourth one called flock. And I think it's really important that I name this one because the way that the research was done initially to come up with the theory about the stress response and the reaction being flight, fight, or freeze, the researcher who did this actually put rats in individual cubicles in order to observe their reactions. And so because they were individual and couldn't get together, they didn't understand that flocking was actually one of the more important reactions when we're in stress response. And so now that we've understood that there's not just 3, but 4, and so all of these are the very basic primitive reactions when we are confronted with a life-threatening situation. So my apologies, by the way, I've got a really bad cold. And so, yes, the arousal system is part of it, but then also, of course, the limbic system, as I was mentioning before. So in terms of the adverse childhood experiences, I definitely wanted to talk about how, how these came about and how to make sense of trauma. And so there were some researchers back in the 90s that studied what are the most common childhood adversities that happen that can impact the child to the point where there is resulting trauma. And so initially there were 7 different categories. And the first one was physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional abuse, having the mother who has been treated violently, living with somebody who is mentally ill, or living with somebody who abusing alcohol or drugs, or having a member of the household who's been incarcerated. So they've noticed that the more a person had many of these different types of categories, the more it showed that later in life, when these children became adults, that this had a true impact on their mental health and on their physical health. And so they had things like heart disease, and depression and so forth. And so they really saw a good correlation between the quantity of adverse childhood situations, and especially these top 7 ones, and how this impacts further in life, physical and mental well-being. And so when they started creating this list, one of the things, because this is back in the 90s, and so now that it's been years and years, there has been an increase in the different types of categories. Now there are other things that we're looking at, for example, like social disadvantage, economic hardship, homelessness, community violence, discrimination, historical trauma, that all of these things can play into the impact onto the person's well-being. Also parental divorce or separation, especially if it's been a very conflictual divorce and separation. If there's been emotional and physical neglect, now that's another one where we used to believe that just abuse itself would be traumatic. And so now we're realizing that neglect as well can be very traumatic for children. And so because we're continuing to work on this type of study, there are other things that are being overlooked in the now that we're looking into now, like, for example, certain racial and ethnic groups that can be disproportionately affected, where there could be some racism or any types of isms. And so, of course, depending on how the brain experiences their world, and so, yes, through the 5 senses, but then the other piece too that's really important to keep in mind is that it's not just about the sight, the sound, the touch, and so forth. There's also the whole piece about the interoception and how you experience your world from inside you. So you can think about not just the children who have gone through actual environmental traumas, but think about those hypersensitive kids that you work with, those kids that are on the autism spectrum, kids that are in the gifted realm, kids that are hypersensitive, how the interoception experience and also the overwhelm of the 5 senses, how this can create pressure and stress onto the body. And this can play into how the limbic system and the automatic, the sympathetic nervous system, how this also plays into, especially if it's in a chronic state, how this plays an impact on the brain, on the emotions, and then of course on the behavior. The other piece that's really important that I wanted to name, especially for those kids that are neurodivergent, so those that are hypersensitive, that are on the autism spectrum and so forth, they have a sensory gating system that is not as well set up as a neurotypical child. So I'm going to show you a different image just to kind of understand it better. So for a neurotypical child, their sensory gating system that is filtering the outside stimuli is very well functioning, very well set up. And so the person is able to block out the noise from their environments and able to focus on the task at hand. But if you look at a sensory gating system that's impaired, and this is the case for most of our sensitive kids, then they're having a harder time being able to block out the noise from their environment. And so to go back to this imagery back here about the senses and the interoception, it's important for us to understand that it's not just the actual environmental traumas that can create trauma onto the body, but also those that are hypersensitive and that are constantly bombarded and overwhelmed by their environment, that this can too, over time, if it's done in a very chronic, intense situation, can have an impact on the brain in a very similar way as a child who's gone through trauma. So it's important to talk about this, because sometimes we really kind of isolate the kids that have had a history of trauma from the other kids, and we give lots of empathy and understanding to that category of children, but understanding that can really apply to many different categories. And so in terms of the impact on the brain, I mentioned before that the younger the child was when they experienced their trauma, the more deeply it has an impact on the body. And so here's an image of two brains. You've got on the left-hand side a healthy brain. So you can see here that there's a good prefrontal cortex functioning, that you've got the temporal lobes. By the way, the temporal lobes is part of the limbic system. So the temporal lobes are functioning well. And then here on the right-hand side, you've got a child who has gone through since birth a severe neglect. This child lived into an orphanage and did not have much care. And so you can see the lack of activation in the brain. So it's not that the brain actually has holes, it's just that the brain is not being activated in those sections. So in order to be able to compare the two brains, what they've done is they've put two different children under stress to see how they react to stress. And so this is a healthy child that reacts to stress versus a child who's gone through trauma, and how you can see that they don't have much capacity to filter and to temper their reactions, very impulsive, very unfiltered. And you can see how their limbic system is very, very impacted from the trauma. And so the double kind of consequence for individuals, children, adolescents, and adults, the impact of trauma on the brain is, on the one hand, the amygdala that hasn't been well calibrated kind of really reacts very intensely, 0 to 10 very fast. And I'm going to show a chart in a second to kind of show you what I mean. And on the other hand, you can see the second handicap, where there's not a good capacity. If we go back to that previous image of the prefrontal cortex that's not working very well, you can see how it's because it's compromised, it's not helping to slow down and to temper the reactions from the limbic system. And so a child who's an adolescent that's gone through trauma really is living with a double handicap. And then if we think about those hypersensitive kids who have the sensory gating system that's not working. So for those kids who both have the hypersensitivity and have a history of trauma, they have a triple invisible handicap. And so you can see how the dysregulated versus the regulated brain, how the brain at the stem is really being kind of overwhelmed, is kind of being, inundated, and having a really hard time blocking out the noise compared to a brain stem for a regulated child. And you can see at the other end for the prefrontal cortex, how there's very little in a dysregulated child, very little capacity for reflection and for perspective and being able to calm themselves down, compared to the regulated child who has full-on functional capacity to be able to temper and to slow things down. So of course, when we're talking about an individual who's gone through trauma, rather than having capacity for integration and being able to have capacity for reflection and thought, really their brain is hijacked by their emotions and by their instincts, and they're all in survival mode. So here's the chart that I wanted to talk about where I was talking about the hypersensitive child and how this plays into versus, and of course the child with trauma versus the child who's neurotypical who has not gone through trauma. So I'll explain this chart for a second. So on the left to the right, we've got from a typical daily challenge to more moderate stress to more threat and distress in the system, in the environment. And so you've got an increasingly capacity from just daily challenge to complete kind of a distressful type of environment. And from the bottom to the top, we've got from the state of being calm to now the state of being hypervigilant and alert, to the state of being alarmed, to the state of being afraid, to the state of being terrorized. So for a neurotypical child who is not too sensitive and does not have it necessarily a history of trauma, it is quite proportionate, their reaction. So as the challenges get more, their reaction to the situation increases as well, very proportionately. However, you can see for a neurodivergent child or a child who's gone through trauma, just at the level of daily challenges to even not even getting quite yet to moderate stress, you can see how quickly it jumps. The reason why it jumps so quickly is because of the amygdala that is not well calibrated. So the amygdala picks up threats and danger very quickly and reacts very intensely. And so you can see from daily challenges to moderate stress how quickly it jumps up. And then it continues, it kind of curves itself out, but you can see at the beginning how quickly it jumps. Now, ideally, what we would want for these children is not necessarily to get rid, because we can't get rid of the way their brain is designed, but what we can do is to help build resilience for these children. And so you can see that a child who's resilient, whether it's a child who's neurotypical or neurodivergent, whether it's a child who has or has not gone through some trauma, if we have been able to work on good resiliency, you can see their good capacity to be able to manage from daily challenges to moderate stress. And so, of course, when we get into a situation where now we're getting into distress and threat, of course, their bodies will reacting accordingly to the environment. So ideally, what we want is to be able to work on this bottom half. And in order to work on this, and we are going to talk about resilience later, is to be able to focus on building resilience for these children. And so how trauma affects the brain, and I kind of already spoke about it, it's just a kind of a way to wrap it up. It can be many-fold, but the three most important pieces to focus on is the fact that the amygdala is really wired for survival and hyper reacts to things on the one hand. On the other hand, you've got the prefrontal cortex that has a hard time regulating the situation and is under responding to the situation. And then you also have the hippocampus, and that's another piece that I did not talk about. The hippocampus is responsible for the memory in the brain. And this is why sometimes children get triggered and react to situations that in the moment don't really make sense to us. And we kind of feel like it's out of nowhere. But sometimes what's happening there for that child is that there was something in their traumatic event that was associated to that situation in the now. And because they have this traumatic event in their kind of seared into their brain, into their memory, sometimes certain scents or certain sounds or certain situations can trigger the trauma because of the hippocampus that is wired that way, given of the exposure to the trauma. And so these are three things to focus, to kind of remember in terms of how trauma affects the brain. So in terms of the long-term damage that it does, and that's the other piece that I think was really important for us to understand, is that for children of any age, long-term damage can occur from a situation of trauma, or it could happen from a prolonged exposure to chronic stress and fear. And so this is where we need to be careful that it's not the one time, necessarily that one time. For some kids, it really is, like that boy that I was talking to you about who had that hospitalization. So for him, it was that one time. But then we can think about other cases where for them, it is that ongoing kind of more chronic toxic situation that over time creates that trauma. And so the body is in a constant state of preparing itself to protect themselves or defend themselves from that threat. And so this impacts on memory and on learning. And so, of course, when they're in the classroom and we're trying to teach them, their body and their brain is not focused, very well and very much onto the learning and on the teaching part, because their body is focused on scanning the room to make sure that they're okay. They're in hypervigilance. And the other piece too is that they're having a hard time hearing the words of what are coming out of our mouth, because when you're in hypervigilance mode, when you're alert, your body is not focused on verbal, they're focused on nonverbal. So they're focused on the tone of voice of the adult, on the body language of the adult, on the facial expressions. And so they have a hard time understanding the words. They're really a being of sensation. So we need to be really careful when we're working with these children who are hypersensitive, who have gone through trauma. We need to be really careful that about our body language and about the paraverbal. And so sometimes what we're saying is very empathetic, and we're trying to help the child, but then our whole body language is kind of contradicting what it is that we're saying. And so we need to be very sensitive to that. For those who have done CPI training, there's discussion in this on the de-escalation portion, that when the child is being affected, in order to de-escalate the situation, we need to be very sensitive about our nonverbal and paraverbal, because this may trigger the child further and escalate the situation further. And so that's why for some of these kids, given the fact that they are in hypervigilance mode and that they are triggered, it is difficult for them to hear what we have to say. And so sometimes talking too much can be triggering, talking too loudly, talking too fast. All of these things can play into that. And so when we're focusing on learning and behavior problems, like a behavioral approach will focus on that at the top and will address that directly. And so what I want to do with you is, I don't want to work at the top of the pyramid. I mean, looking at the analogy of the iceberg, I want to go at the bottom of it. I want to focus on when the sensitivities are being overwhelmed, how the defenses are coming up to protect the child, how now the child's not feeling their emotions, because they're stuck. And now because of all of this stuckness, this brings on the learning and behavior problems. What I want to focus is for us to work at the bottom here, to be able to help, bring the brain to rest, to be able to regulate the brain, to be able to bring on safety for the child and with the relationship, with the environment. And so this indirectly will help answer these problems by working at it from the root. And so I mentioned before that children that have, and adolescents, of course, that have gone through trauma or hypersensitivity, that they do have a defendedness there with learning. Learning is something that is really difficult for them. And so part of the reason why is because learning is really vulnerable. Learning new things, having to ask questions, making mistakes and so forth, exploring the unknown, having to present new ideas, all of that can be very vulnerable for students. And so if you are already somebody who has had a traumatic past, and then you're caught in a situation that's very vulnerable, this can actually trigger the brain into believing that you're in a threatening situation. And then the child will then shut down and not take a chance, not take a risk, not move forward, not be open and vulnerable and so forth. It is really difficult for them to see their mistakes, to experience failure. Sometimes these kids, to be able to avoid those situations, will find themselves into very disturbing types of behaviors, whether it's aggression, whether it's a flight response, to be able to avoid these situations. And so this is coming from the limbic system. And so rarely do they ask for help. And so, of course, if we look at, it's kind of like a vicious circle, right? Because on the one hand, they're avoiding this vulnerable place because it's too much for them to handle. But then on the other hand, they're creating this gap of knowledge where they're learning less and less. And so the gap is getting wider and wider, and it makes it harder and harder for them to be able to catch up. So we can see this kind of vicious circle with them to be able to face this vulnerability. And so the other thing too is that relationships are really difficult for these children, especially if they've been into an abusive or neglectful situation, it's difficult for them to trust the adults, to be able to open up, to be able to be vulnerable, and to be able to learn from them. And so how can we, the adults, try to collect these students? Collect meaning engaging them, to be attuned to them and to their attachment and so forth. Being careful to not push eye contact, because sometimes that's really vulnerable for them. Being careful that we don't put pressure and for them to have to look at us in the eyes. Attachment can feel very vulnerable. They may be afraid of rejection and so forth. And so we need to be very sensitive to that. So if we're going to look at an approach that is not just trauma aware, not just trauma sensitive, but that is trauma responsive. And so here's what we need to look at to our schools in order to put in place. And so the first piece is of course, the science of trauma. How can we have a better insight into what trauma is? How does that impact? And so if we have good insight, what we see will help us to give the cues on what to do about it. And so, of course, if we think about the child who is being triggered and is in stress response, we will have a very different reaction as an adult than if we think the child is choosing to do this on purpose and is able to do differently and able to control their emotions and behavior. This will completely change the way that we're going to see the situation. And so, of course, I invite you to do some more reading on understanding trauma, understanding hypersensitivity, and so forth. I do have some presentations on my website on, that's more in depth on these topics. I also had on that first slide some of these key authors that discuss trauma. And so I invite you to go and do more reading. The other piece that's really important as a school team is for us to all be on the same page, to be able to have a common mindset, to have a universal understanding of certain things, and that the language is similar to some extent. The other piece too is to be able to have a reflective practice. So we're not just being reactive all the time. We're trying to put in place things that are preventative. And so this is when we're going to be talking about the pyramid of intervention, where we're not just focusing on addressing crisis situations. We're going to look at now, how can we put things in place preventatively, and how, so to using the PDSA approach, so that's the Plan, Do, Study, Act, is that we plan an approach, we put it in place, we check and see if it works. And if it doesn't work the way that we want, now we need to readjust it. And so how can we have a plan, especially for our top 3 students, knowing that they have a history of trauma, or that they are hypersensitive, or that they're really struggling with their behavior? What reflective plan can we have in place for these students? Something that is concrete, something that is in writing, that is formal, something that is shown to all of the team that is working with that student. So going back to that common mindset. So the importance of having these things in place. So in terms of focusing on the prevention, with that chart that we looked before about resilience, so how can we build resilience in children? And this in turn will help the behavior and the learning, rather than focusing at the top of the pyramid. And so yes, the pyramid of intervention, we're going to look at that. That's going to work hand in hand. Having a collaborative approach where we can work as a team. So yes, tier 1, we're looking at best universal practices in the classroom. But then for those key students that are, that have a history of trauma and that are more behavioral types of students that are tier 2, probably more tier 3, what collaborative approach do we have for these kids? And instead of keeping them in class at all costs where they're not succeeding, can we have times and places in the building, in the school, where they can have success, where they can have respite, where they're able to release, where they're able to be able to build their resilience and so forth. And so to be able to have that collaborative approach where the pressure is not all onto the teacher, that we're able, or on, I'm saying the teacher, but like a specific adult, and that we're able to share the weight of those students as a team. The other piece too is in terms of adult-centered approach. And so rather than having an intervention that is about the child being responsible, they need to be conscious of their behavior, they need to self-regulate and so forth, that we're looking at it from a supportive approach. The adult needs to be there to respond, to support, to scaffold. And so instead of doing self-regulation, we're looking at co-regulation. So we're doing this together. And of course, that we're focusing on the root of the problem. So going back to the idea of the pyramid, we're looking at the root of the problem rather than just at the symptoms. And so in terms of the pyramid, at the bottom of the pyramid, the staff are provided training to understand the impact of trauma on young children, their families, and themselves. And so the programs support trauma-informed approach. And so your trauma-informed would be built into your best practices. Children who have experienced trauma will need close, secure relationships and safe, predictable environments. And so the Nurturing Support Center would be a perfect example of a space in the school where the child can feel safe and where things are predictable and where there are secure relationships. So in terms of the targeted social emotional supports, children who have experienced trauma might need help with regulating their emotions and learning skills to cope with their feelings. And so this is not done the child that they're responsible for themselves. We're doing this together as a team. We're putting in place different resources to help the child build capacity, to build resilience, and to be able to find ways to release safely and to be able to build their resilience. And at the top of the pyramid, we're putting in place individualized interventions. And so this is where it's really important and key that we have formal plans for these kids and that are developed by a collaborative team that considers the function of the child's behavior, the context of the family and the family's culture, and the child's experiences, including the history of trauma. And so all the whole piece of trauma is built into that specific plan for the child. So in terms of behavior, kind of to wrap up this section, important to understand that behavior is not something that changes because the child chooses to change it or because the adult is trying to control it. Behavior changes because of the following four things: because the child's not overwhelmed in their bodies with their sensory experience, that their body's not in stress response. And so if the body and the brain is feeling safe and feeling regulated, this helps to prevent from things getting completely disorganized. In terms of attachment, how important it is for those children to be able to have safe and nurturing adults for whom they can lean on, they can feel that they can depend on, and so forth. And so this helps in order to kind of temper the behavior, because given that they're feeling safe with the adult, this helps for them not to be dysregulated and disorganized. Same thing with their sense of vulnerability and emotions. Can we help them to feel safe enough that they can allow themselves to be vulnerable, they can allow themselves to feel and to release their emotions in a safe way? And so once were able to stay vulnerable and soft and tender, and that they're able to express those emotions, this will help in terms minimize the behavior. And of course, ultimately it's the maturation in the brain. And so if we go back to that image where we had the healthy brain next to the trauma brain, and by the way, I forgot to mention, it's not because a child has gone through a history of trauma and that they have sections in the brain that is not activated, that it means that the child is never, that it's too late and that they can never build that capacity in the brain. It is never too late to be able to build that capacity in the brain. And so we just need to have the right conditions. And so if the child can feel safe, if the child can feel accompanied, supported, if they have good outlets to release and so forth, that they're able to build their resilience, then the brain will develop, and then they will be able to mature, and then they will be able to have the capacity of the prefrontal cortex to temper their impulsive types of reactions. And so what doesn't work with these kids? I mentioned before that the verbal is not something that works very well with them. And so trying to talk too much, to try to reason with them doesn't work. But the other thing that we need to keep into mind too, is that consequences definitely do not work for these kids. I'll kind of just read through the slide. So talking keeps them in high arousal. It keeps them into the flight or fight mode and intensifies I shouldn't have written agony. I should have said it intensifies the stress in the system. When the child is in survival mode, they cannot hear your words, just your tone. They cannot process language, the words that you're using. All they're hearing is your tone. And if they can't remember the future because they're caught into the now, then of course consequences don't mean anything to them because they can't focus into the future, and consequences actually can make them even more frustrated and more dysregulated. And the piece too that we need to keep in mind is that when the adults are frustrated and that they're putting in place consequences, the thing that the child is hearing is not, I need to reflect on my behavior. What they're worried about is that they may hear from the adult, I've had it with you. You know, it's enough, no more. And so all of this can trigger and can play into the whole trauma cycle for these children. And so the other thing that doesn't work for them, and so I already mentioned consequences, timeouts and behavior management systems don't work for these kids. And so timeouts increase the separation of alarm and frustration, which can lead for them to disengage, to harden, and then not to care. And then once they're stuck, it is much more difficult to work with them when they're disconnected in that way. Consequences in time of high emotions, and when there's no capacity for integration, it is not the way to go, because consequences can increase frustration for that child who's already struggling to manage their frustration, and there isn't that integrative functioning to be able to temper it. And all of these behavior management systems focus on the child's struggles rather than their good intentions and efforts. And so rather than building their capacity for resilience and their capacity for what they can be successful on, what we're trying to do is to try to control and put pressure and expectation on the portions where they're having a hard time managing. It may increase disengagement, it may increase hardening, and it may make the relationship contingent onto their good performance. And so now the child feels that our attachment is conditional. So rather than focusing on a behavioral approach, going back to that pyramid, we're going to focus about what are the basic needs and go at it from the top, from the bottom up. And so we're looking at building the attachment. We're looking at setting up that sense of security. We're looking at giving them space and permission to feel their emotions, to express their emotions, to release their emotions. Yes, we can do this in a safe way. And the emotions room can be a place to do that. And the Nurturing Support Center could also be a place for them to do that. And of course, the experience of play. And so how can we put play through, and I don't mean frivolous play, I really mean the true play where we're using different resources and different materials where the child's in play mode to be able to feel safe enough to put out there what's within them. And so to go back to that pyramid, so now we're focusing on the relationship, and through the support of the relationship, now the child is feeling safe. Now we're reducing the defenses and the emotions. Now the child is able to feel their emotions and being able to temper those emotions. Now we've got healthy flow. And because we've got a healthy flow, now we're minimizing the learning and the behavior problems. Now this becomes the behavior and learning resolutions. So the pyramid of intervention and the Nurturing Support Center, the focus is looking at how can we work at this at the bottom rather than focusing at the behavior directly. The other piece too is in terms of the trauma is being careful about our own energy into the dynamic. So I mentioned being careful about our verbal and being careful about our nonverbal and our paraverbal, but we also need to be careful about where we're at too in this stress curve. And so if the child is at a place where they're completely stressed out and we too are very triggered by that situation, it might be a good idea to tap into another adult who's not as triggered to step into that situation. So to go back to working as a team, making sure that we don't get into their bubble. You know, if you go back to the CPI training, the training says to you that when you're in crisis intervention, rather than walking into the situation, you're supposed to pull back and give more space, to give more bubble to the child, to not trigger them as much. And so rather than being in their space, the idea here is how can we create space, give them bubble, give them distance, and that we're careful not just where we're at in the stress curve, but where there's the child at. And so when we're trying to challenge the child, we're not challenging them here because at this point, they're no longer receptive to that. And so you need to pay attention to where they're at in their stress curve. And so if they're not too stressed, yes, here we want to connect with them and challenge them and motivate them to be able to be, you know, ask the right questions, to be emergent, to be curious, to want to learn and so forth. But once they start being a bit more stressed up the curve, now we're focusing not on challenging them, but now we're trying to relate to them. We're trying to normalize, we're trying to support them. Once we're past that, now at this point, we're not just validating where they're at, we're also co-regulating. So it's not about putting the pressure for them to self-regulate, we're doing this together. And at this point, we're focusing on de-escalation. So everything you've learned from crisis intervention would be applied here. And we're looking at inviting release. We're not looking at trying to challenge or trying to relate to them. We're not talking to them at this point. We're taking a step back and we're working at inviting release and to de-escalate. This is our sole focus in that moment. So I love this quote. So having the vision of, rather than being a sculptor where we're trying to sculpt the child into being what we want them to be, we're looking at it from the gardener's philosophy. And so the gardener's intuitive and understands that you can't pull on the flower for it to grow and for it to blossom. We understand that we need to give the flower the right conditions. So we're giving it the water, the soil, the sun. And so it's the same thing with our students. So when a flower doesn't bloom, you fix the environment in which it grows, not the flower. And so can we, with our students, put in place in their environment what they need in order to recenter themselves and in order to be successful? How can we scaffold for them? So part of that is the prevention piece. And so I mentioned before that, students are not receptive and not disposed to us when they're under stress. They're not accessible, they're disengaged and disconnected. And so it's important that we're focusing on a sense of safety, on building the attachment, on having a structure and a routine and predictability, having tools where we're introducing them, we're exploring them, we're practicing them, and we're focusing on growth, but growth only happens in moments of rest. And so this is why, rather than focusing on intervention when students are triggered, this is not when we make headway. We make headway when children are at rest and when they're receptive. And so this is why we need to put in place plans for these kids and the preventative mode. And so to go back to this analogy, focusing on building that resilience and being in the preventative. And so in terms of resilience, so how do we build resilience for students? And so there are three pieces that are at play here in order to build resilience. And I just want to define resilience for a second, in case that's not clear to people. Resilience is about bouncing back from a situation. So it doesn't mean that it wasn't difficult to manage. It doesn't mean that it wasn't hard. It doesn't mean that we were not emotional. It doesn't mean that we were not triggered by it. Is that even though we were affected by the situation, we were able to bounce back from it. This is what true resilience is. And there's a lot of misinformation out there. There's a lot of false definitions of what true resilience is. Oftentimes I've come across material where they talk about resilience as the capacity to cope, as the capacity to power through, the capacity to be tough, the capacity to be able to handle. And this is not what we're talking about. This is coping. Coping and resilience are two different things. And so it's okay to focus on coping here and there, but ultimately what we want in order to be emotionally healthy is to be able to bounce back, is to be able to be resilient. And resiliency can only happen thanks to the following three things. Number one, for the individual to feel safe. And so this is why putting in place a context of prevention, putting in place, for example, the Nurturing Support Center, having tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3 interventions, we're helping for the environment to be predictable. We're helping them to have present and nurturing adults. And so this is where we're building the sense of safety. The second piece is to be able to help the students express their emotions. And so can we make space, of course, in a very safe way, and you have to have good timing. It's not that we let students express anywhere at any time. We need to have a place and time for these things, but can we make space and invite the emotions, and not just for them to calm down, not just for them to be quiet, not just for them to be happy, is to be able to make space for all of the range of emotions. Can we allow for them to be frustrated? Can we allow for them to be sad and to have tears? Can we allow for them to be alarmed and to be afraid and to be worried and so forth, and to make space for that expression? And so we'll talk a bit more about that in a second. And the third one, but this third one doesn't happen before the other two, is for the capacity for the student to discover their courage, to discover their strength. And even though the situation could have been very distressful and very difficult, that they were able to survive it, that they're okay on the other end. And so, yes, it was hard, but I made it through. And so when they're able to experience these situations, and play is actually a good example, being in the play mode, whether it's through theater, whether it's through journaling, whether it's through using puppets, or whether it, whatever types of through creative arts, to be able to take the risk, to try to be vulnerable, but to realize that even though it was difficult and uncomfortable, that you're still okay and you're alive, to build their sense of strength and courage in them. But this cannot happen until we've got the first two. And so I would say, as a school staff, the two most important are really the safety and the expression. Once you are able to establish the two, yes, through the emotional expression, you could try to work on the sense of courage. But to me, this is secondary to the first two. And so in terms of the pyramid of intervention, I've got a whole page on my website that is dedicated to this, looking at best practices into the classroom, looking at having structures, having routines, having visuals, having alternative seating, having emotional release activities, having brain breaks. We do this as a classroom. This is meant to be for all. And so children that are at tier 3 don't just benefit from having an individualized plan, they also benefit from having the tier 1 approach and being able to do with everybody, where they're not singled out, and that everybody gets to have these support measures in place. In terms of tier 2, so those more challenging students that need to have something a bit more targeted, having a significant adult with whom they can do daily check-ins with, having a designated area in the classroom, a quiet corner where they can go and cocoon themselves, they can go and take respite or take a break, that they have sensory materials that they can work with. And so this helps to be able for them to feel safe and to be able to express their emotions. At this point, for the more targeted interventions, we're looking at sometimes some of these universal, but now we are assigning them to the student, or we're scheduling it for them. They're in their plan. At this point, we're starting to look at not just supports in the classroom, but we're also looking at supports outside of the class. Could they go with a "you've got mail" envelope, go bring it to another adult, where they're going not just for the group and the teacher to take a break from that student, but for the student to take a break from that situation as well. And then they go do a release activity with the adult. And so I've got a section on my website where you can look at the "you've got mail," where they've got a bin for themselves. And in that bin, they've got tools that are helping them to be able to recenter themselves, that they are good at, that they can feel successful with, and so forth. And so having a bin in place could be a wonderful way of helping those students feel successful. In terms of the tier 3, now tier 3, we're looking at individualized one-to-one. Could they have daily check-ins, and those daily check-ins would be done into the nurturing support center? Could they have time maybe in the tech room or in the emotions room, if you guys have one, where they're able to release some of these emotions that are too accumulated in their system? If these are kids that are not functioning well into the classroom, could they have pockets of time where they're actually doing academics in the nurturing support center rather than doing it in the classroom because they're not successful right now in the class? And so looking at progressive intervention from best to all, targeted to some, and individualized for few, and always thinking about preventative. And so in terms of the nurturing support center, the nurturing support center is not supposed to be the end-all be-all strategy. It's supposed to be part of the pyramid of intervention. And so when you're putting in place a nurturing support center in your school, all of this needs to be put in place too. It's not just about having a nurturing support center that compensates for these other approaches. It's supposed to be done together, hand in hand. And so, and the emotional nurturing, the nurturing support center is not just for behavioral and emotional support, it's also for academic support. And so where there's almost like a mini resource section in the room where students can do one-to-one academics, where they've got resource supports, where they're able to bridge that gap of knowledge that they're missing because of all the behavior and so forth. And so the Nurturing Support Center, if you're interested in knowing more, there's a whole page dedicated on my website to that. And I've got a video recording where you can actually see the space. So of course, this example is a whole classroom size nurturing support center. There's no expectation that it has to be this size. If you don't have this space in your school and it is something that it would be half a school's classroom size or a quarter, that's okay. You would just have less sections in it. One thing though that is key is that a nurturing support center is not meant to be a reward. It's not meant to be a punishment. It is meant to serve as the function of answering a student's need in their plan. And so it's not a segregated class. It's part of the continuum of intervention, like I mentioned. It's supposed to be relationship-based. And so everything in the philosophy of the Nurturing Support Center is about the space and the adults to be focusing on attachment and safety. The environment is supposed to be structured and predictable. There needs to be pockets where students can feel can have the quiet, can have the sense of safety, or able to cocoon themselves. You've got a tent here, that's a good example. And we're trying to provide respite, not just for the student, but also for the other kids and the teacher in the classroom. So the key kind of elements in this room is the calm environment. If we're thinking about trauma, having the sense of safety, the caring adult, the structure and predictability, the opportunities for student to talk if they want to talk, but then could there be other options in the space where through nonverbals, they can kind of release and express some of these emotions, having a variety of calming places, having a variety of activities to help process those emotions. Yes, the academic support's really important with the tools. And of course, the other piece that is so key is the communication with the team and the Nurturing Support Center and the rest of the school. So things are not meant to be in isolation. We're supposed to work back and forth and to be able to relay information from the classroom to the Nurturing Support Center and back. And so the idea of them feeling contained, but not isolated, not controlled, just feeling contained. And so who are the students that are usually referred to this space? And so highly sensitive students that are easily overwhelmed, students that struggle with big emotions, students that have difficulty with family situations or other types of situations in their life, and that are struggling with unstructured times. And so these would be typical students that we would be referring to the Nurturing Support Center. Of course, these are kids that have behavior that are disruptive in the classroom and so forth. And so these would be the typical types of students. And so part of the Nurturing Support Center can be scheduled, and it can also be not scheduled. And so in the scheduled, we would have the check-ins. We would have, if the student can't manage being in class the whole time, would have pockets of time in the class and then pockets of time in the Nurturing Support Center. So we'd have shorter class time. It would be that sometimes certain students have a hard time with certain subject areas, with substitute teachers, with certain times in the day. And so would have pockets of time that are scheduled into the Nurturing Support Center. And it can also be done not just during class time, but during recess and lunch. And so having a sheltered time in the Nurturing Support Center. In terms of the unscheduled time, it could be that if there's a substitute teacher, if all of a sudden there's you've done a check-in with the student and they're not doing well because there was a home situation, and so we're deciding to keeping them for a short period in the Nurturing Support Center. If the teacher is determining that the student needs a break, and this is something that is spontaneous and was not scheduled, when the student needs a quiet time to be able to do individual work, and when the student is upset. And so these could be all different reasons why students are referred to the Nurturing Support Center. So the Nurturing Support Center has been thought through in terms of the layout. There needs to be different sections, and each sections have their own rationale, their own purpose. And so this is a whole classroom size. So there's many, many different sections. If you had half the size, priority would be to have a cocooning, calming area. Of course, to have the check-in corner. Perhaps there would be a physical movement corner. Of course, the academic piece needs to remain because that's so central to the Nurturing Support Center, having a section for emotions. And so all of that would kind of be key pieces in priority if you had a smaller space. By the way, you will be getting a copy of the PowerPoint. I can't recall if I sent it to Elsa already or if you haven't gotten it yet, but I will make sure to send you a copy if I didn't. I just wanted to kind of walk it through a little bit with some pictures to kind of give you guys a visual. And so this is an example of a classroom size Nurturing Support Center. This is the entrance. And so what's nice about here is that we have a welcoming poster where we tell the students, if let's say the adult is busy with another student, we tell the student where they can go and what they can do while they're waiting for the adult to become available. And so in the entrance, there's also a sensory corner. And so sometimes it helps for students to recenter themselves before they go somewhere else into the space. We talked about having a variety of calming corners. So sometimes it could be, for example, a tent. It could be that they have a comfortable couch or a comfortable chair that they're able to go and do a puzzle to be able to recenter themselves, that maybe they're going to go hide underneath a desk and maybe they're going to focus on an activity at hand and so forth. And so these could be many different places where students can go when they first arrive and to be able to recenter themselves. In terms of cocooning sections, it doesn't have to be that you buy a tent. You could very easily make your own. You could have cardboard boxes. You could use a desk and just put a material so they can go and hide underneath. There's many different ways that you can do this with very little funds. In terms of having calming areas, so I mentioned having a comfy chair, an egg chair. Of course, you can't do this for high school, but an egg chair is something that can be very popular. I forgot to put pictures for the high school, but I do have nurturing support centers at the high school. And of course, they're set up a bit different at the high school, where they may not be as colorful. And of course, they are corners still in those spaces, but the purposes for the corners may be a bit different at the high school. I mentioned the sensory area. Always important to have a variety of different materials. And so we're looking at to offer support for many different types of needs and not just focusing on few needs. And so when you have a variety of different things, it really helps to cater to different students. Having a physical movement area where students can go and release. And so this is different from an emotions room. An emotions room is where the student is completely disorganized and just needs to kind of let it out. In a physical area corner, the child would be more regulated. And so the child just needs to have some release, but that they're not completely disorganized. And it could be that they have, for example, here they have a mini trampoline. They've got here a dart with darts that are with Velcro. So all of these things are very safe. And all of the materials that you put in here are not meant to be dangerous in any way, shape, or form. The emotions area is very important. And so being able to build emotional literacy, having pictures of emotions with true faces. These are all, by the way, on our website. And I do have a squawk box for high school. And so if you're interested in going to check out on our website, if I've got a second, I'll show you guys where it is on the website, all of the materials. But this would be to be able to have, for students have access to recognizing their emotions and naming their emotions. And so here's the folder for elementary. For younger elementary, where we've got very few different types of emotions, we've got one that's more sophisticated for older students, looking at what's not working that is impacting the behavior, the emotions, and what are the tools that we could be using. And so this is the individual bin. And so in the bin, we would have different activities for the student, but we would also have the tools. So the tools that are here in this folder, we would have what we call a personal choice board. And the student would have for themselves that board that is set up ahead of time where they choose what are their top activities that they like to do to help them recenter themselves. And so this is done with the child and the adult together preventatively. The building and creating area section. And so sometimes students don't want to talk about their emotions. They don't even want to look at material on emotions. And so sometimes being able to use fine motor activities or building and creating types of activities, it can help students not just recenter themselves, but to be able to express through drawing, through any types of creative art activities. This could be a way to help them kind of move through some of these emotions, to be able to express. So these are other examples of fine motor. This is a huge one that we promote very much in terms of knitting, corking, and this can be done as much at the elementary as it can be done at the high school level. Same thing with puzzles. There are 3D puzzles now. Lego is another one. You can have Lego for high school as well. These are all things that can be used with students to be able to help them not just recenter themselves, but to be able to be creative and to release some of that. Using books. And so there are books that exist at the high school level with activities, talking about different emotions, walking through some of these characters. So not necessarily having to talk about the student, but talking about emotions in general. And sometimes it helps to be able to talk about a character rather than talking about yourself, and to be able to accompany them with their emotions. These are on our website as well. And so I talked about having the academic / resource corner into the emotions room. And so here it is. All of the materials are available. They're easy access. They are visual and so forth. And so these two are available on our website. Having quiet corners where students can go and focus on individual work. And not just having corners, but also having some materials. And this too is on our website. So to be able to create a plan for our tier 3 students, what are we putting in place for them during recess, during class time? Is there a check-in? Is there flexible seating that's being put in place? So what's working for those students? What do we need to implement that's new? What's not working for that student? So this is an ongoing working document that we're using to be able to put a plan in place for that student. So ultimately, what helps for a nurturing support center to be successful is the following: to have a physical space. And like I mentioned, obviously, if you can't have a whole classroom size, it's okay if you have a smaller space, but making sure that we've got the minimum of the priority sections. We need to have buy-in from the staff and the administration. There needs to be commitment. There needs to be training. And so having training on trauma, training on aggression, training on anxiety, training on counter will and on alpha and so forth. And so, training is really part of that, really important. Having communication between the team and the school, of course, with collaboration, having some monies set aside, because you do need to assign staffing to that room. Depending on the size of your school, you have a minimum of 1 full-time adult. Some schools have 2. Some have additionally a part-time resource teacher that gets involved to help with those tier 3 kids, being able to purchase materials, furniture. Sometimes schools already have furniture that they can repurpose for that space, and that's okay. You don't need to buy furniture necessarily. And food is a huge one that's really important too, to be able to have snacks for these kids, and that builds a sense of relationship and safety. And of course, the most important focus there in the room is a sense of safety, the sense of belonging, and the freedom to express. And so without these key elements, a nurturing support center cannot be successful. So I mentioned the emotions room. I just kind of wanted to show you a picture. That could be a secondary space that could be ideally near the nurturing support center, but it doesn't have to be. And so this space is to allow for students that are completely disorganized to be able to recenter themselves. And what is different from this room to a calm down room is that we're not sending them there to calm down. We are sending them there with the message that they are invited to release their emotions, and only once they have released will they find the calm after the storm. And so it's not about saying to the kid, you need to go calm down, you need to go and reflect, you need to go and recenter yourself. We are sending them with the support and the materials to be able to release, so they can find the calm in themselves after that. So I finished with the PowerPoint. I'm going to stop sharing, and I'm going to stop the recording for now because I do want to make space for some questions.